the Huskie engine that made Brockway the toughest truck in the East. In 1968, a small truck company out of Cortland, New York, landed on the cover of Overdrive Magazine. The headline called it the most rugged truck in the world. Not America, the world. The company had fewer than 1,000 employees, it had one factory, and it had never once built its own engine. So how does a regional truck builder with no proprietary power plant earn a title like that? That is the Brockway story, and it starts, of all places, with a cabinet maker and his coffin shop. William Northrop Brockway opened a furniture workshop in Homer, New York in 1851. Small town, population under 4,000. William built cabinets, wardrobes, bed frames, and chairs. He was also the local undertaker, which meant he sold coffins out of the same showroom where he displayed his rosewood sideboards, cherry coffins, butternut coffins, pine coffins of all sizes and prices, trimmed in the best materials on an hour's notice. That is a direct description from his own newspaper advertisements. When you build furniture and coffins in a town that small, you learn something about craftsmanship because your customers live next door and they will tell you exactly what they think. By 1875, William had pivoted from furniture to vehicles. He purchased a defunct carriage works on South Main Street in Homer, and within a decade the Brockway Carriage Works employed 160 men, turning out 2,500 vehicles a year. Buggies, spring wagons, platform wagons. The factory complex grew to 13 buildings spread across 3 acres, powered by a 50-horsepower stationary steam engine, with a blacksmith shop running 12 separate fires. Industry publications cited it as the largest carriage company owned by a single individual in the country. Brockway wagons were shipped to dealers across the eastern seaboard, and his advertising ran in newspapers from Homer to Pennsylvania. William died in 1889. He was 60 years old. His employees led the funeral procession to Glenwood Cemetery, and the plant foreman lowered his body into the ground. The town passed a resolution honoring him, noting that his energy had triumphed over all obstacles, and that his loss would be keenly felt. His son George took over, and George had a different kind of vision. In 1909, George began experimenting with motorized trucks. He did not have the engineering talent to design one from scratch, so he enlisted the Chase Motor Truck Company out of Syracuse, about 35 miles north. Chase was founded by a former Franklin automobile engineer named Orrin Chase, a graduate of Boston Tech, which later became MIT. Chase built crude, high-wheeled commercial trucks with air-cooled 2-stroke engines, 3 cylinders, 7 moving parts. They were ugly and basic, but they ran. George bought knockdown Chase chassis, shipped them to Homer, fitted them with Brockway commercial bodies, and sold about 30 of these rebadged trucks between 1910 and 1912. They looked like someone had bolted a motor onto a hay wagon, which functionally is about right. But George understood his customers, the farmers, the loggers, the road crews, the breweries and dairies scattered across upstate New York. They did not care about innovation. They cared about whether the thing would start on a January morning at 10 below zero and haul a load up a hill without breaking in half. George saw the opportunity and committed fully. In February of 1912, he incorporated the Brockway Motor Truck Company with $100,000 in capital. He leased a factory on Central Avenue in Cortland, a building previously occupied by the Ellis Omnibus and Cab Company. His brother-in-law, Fred Thompson, a dentist who left his practice to go into business, came on as treasurer and general manager. Rodman Reed, Chase's chief engineer, and another former Franklin man, signed on as Brockway's chief engineer. Reed would stay with the company for decades, eventually serving on SAE technical committees for truck design. The team was small, experienced, and hungry. The first proper Brockway, a Model A, powered by a 32-horsepower engine, went to the Miller Corset Company of Cortland. 95 trucks rolled out in the first 15 months, not a world-beating number. But every single one was custom-built to the buyer's specific requirements. And that approach, that willingness to build exactly what the customer asked for, would define everything Brockway did for the next 65 years. Here is the thing about Brockway that separated it from Mack, from International, from GMC. Brockway was what the industry called an assembled truck. They did not manufacture their own engines, transmissions, or axles. They bought the best components available from the best suppliers and put them together with obsessive precision. Continental engines in the early days, Brownlight transmissions, Timken axles, Parrish steel frames from Reading, Pennsylvania. Champion sheet metal in Cortland stamped out the hoods, cabs, fenders, and cowlings. Bush and Rome Turney supplied the radiators. Some people in the industry considered this a weakness. A real truck manufacturer built everything in-house. Mack did. GMC did. White and International did. Brockway's answer was pragmatic. Why pour millions into engine development when Cummins already makes the best diesel on the market? Why design a transmission when Fuller already perfected one? Focus on what you do better than anyone else. Integration, fit, finish, build quality, and customization. The approach had a hidden advantage nobody talked about. Brockway's basic designs barely changed from year to year. A parts department that stocked components for a 1960 Brockway could service a 1970 model without batting an eye. Mechanics who learned one generation of Brockway basically learned them all. In an industry where downtime meant lost revenue and complexity killed profitability, that consistency was worth more than any proprietary technology ever could be. Fleet operators with big shops and their own parts inventories knew that new models would not make their existing stock obsolete. That kind of loyalty does not come from advertising. It comes from never letting your customer down, and Brockway built every single truck to order. You wanted a 117-inch bumper-to-back of cab dimension for a long wheelbase highway tractor? Done. A short wheelbase dump truck with a specific rear axle ratio for mountain grades? No problem. A cab with a factory sleeper option for the long-haul guys? Available since 1946. The Brockway factory on Central Avenue was essentially a bespoke truck shop operating at industrial scale. Now you do not survive 2 world wars and a Great Depression on consistency alone. You also need guts. When the United States entered World War I, Brockway won a contract to build 1,000 Class B Liberty trucks. Heavy-duty military haulers assembled to strict government specifications. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, and the contract was canceled after Brockway had completed 587 units. With a warehouse full of surplus Liberty truck parts, George Brockway did what any smart manufacturer would do. He turned them into the Model T, a modified 5-ton civilian hauler that became a hit with construction outfits and municipalities. Lemons into lemonade. The man built coffins and carriages before this. Adaptation was in the blood. After the war, Brockway expanded aggressively. Factory branches opened across the Northeast: Albany, Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Rochester, Syracuse. By the mid-1920s, the company was exporting trucks to 65 countries. Foreign business accounted for 1/3 of total sales. Net income in 1925 hit over $700,000. They even opened a factory branch in Sydney, Australia. In 1928, Brockway merged with Indiana Truck Corporation out of Marion, Indiana. Combined assets topped $9 million. Combined sales exceeded $15 million. 38 factory branches between them. For a brief, optimistic moment, Brockway looked like it was becoming a national powerhouse. Then the Depression hit. The Indiana operation was sold to White Motor Company. Brockway retreated to its roots. Custom trucks for loyal customers in the Northeast. Smaller, tighter, but still building. In 1934, they rolled out the V1200, a beast of a machine powered by a 240-horsepower V12 engine from American LaFrance. It could carry loads up to 15 tons and hit 45 miles per hour doing it. One of the heaviest trucks in America at the time. World War II brought another surge. Brockway manufactured the B666 heavy truck, bridge erectors, and crane carriers. The 6-ton 6x6 bridging trucks used massive Hercules HXD engines, 855 cubic inches of inline-six gasoline power, 202 horsepower at 2150 RPM, 642 pound-feet of torque at 900 revolutions per minute. These were not fast machines. They were built to haul pontoon bridge sections across destroyed European roads and not get stuck. 1,165 of them came out of Cortland during the war. When the boys came home, Brockway pivoted back to civilian production with the 260 series, powered by a 572 cubic inch Continental gasoline engine. In 1946 alone, 4,212 trucks shipped, the best sales year in company history. Then things got quiet, too quiet. By the early 50s, sales were declining badly. 4,000 trucks in 46, 611 in 54. The post-war truck market was consolidating fast. The big players had the dealer networks, the advertising budgets, the manufacturing scale. Brockway had a cult following in the Northeast and not much else. Several companies came courting. Continental, White Motor Company, H&B American Machine. But in August of 1956, Mack Trucks wrote the check, roughly $3 million initially, completing the full acquisition by 1959 for about $12 million. And this is where the Husky was born. Mack wanted Brockway to keep its own identity, separate brand, separate factory, separate dealer base. They already had the Bulldog. Brockway needed its own mascot. A young kid named Jim Duncan, whose father Bill worked at the Brockway plant, suggested the Alaskan Malamute. He had been watching a television show called Sergeant Preston of the Yukon. Management liked it. In 1957, the first Husky dog hood ornament appeared on the model N260TL. The spelling, for reasons nobody has ever fully explained, was Huskie, not Husky. That is just how Brockway did things. James Cambria, formerly Mack's vice president, took charge of the Brockway division and announced the first complete truck redesign since 1935. The new line of Huskies was angular, squared-off fenders, fiberglass-reinforced plastic body panels, modern and aggressive. This basic style would carry Brockway through the 70s, right up until the factory doors closed for the last time. Quick thing. If you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do deep dives like this regularly. All right. The 300 series, introduced in 1965, was the truck lineup that cemented Brockway's reputation as the toughest thing on wheels east of the Mississippi. Start with the packaging. The 300 series offered bumper-to-back-of-cab dimensions from 90 inches all the way to 117 inches. That is a massive range. Short cab dump trucks on one end, full-length highway tractors on the other, every conceivable configuration in between. The fenders were hinged at the front and swung outward on a single bolt. One wrench, 15/16. Remove the bolt, swing the fender open, and the entire side of the engine compartment was exposed. The butterfly hood split down the middle and opened from both sides, giving full overhead access to the power plant. An old mechanic who worked at the Brockway dealership in Clearwater, Florida, remembered this setup decades later. You needed one bolt and one wrench to open the whole front end of the truck. Compared to working on other heavy trucks of the era, where getting to the engine meant an hour of removing panels and cursing, the Brockway was almost civilized. Almost. The 300 series also debuted Brockway's iconic fiberglass grille insert, a distinctive mesh pattern set into a chrome trim surround that made a Brockway instantly identifiable from a quarter-mile away. Every trucker on the East Coast knew that face. It was as recognizable in New York and Pennsylvania as a Peterbilt grill was in California or a Kenworth's T-shaped nose was in Oregon. The model designations told you what you were looking at. The 360 was the set-forward front axle model, the 361 was the setback, the 358 and 359 were the short BBC high engine mount variants designed to swallow the biggest available V8 diesels. Detroit Diesel 8 V71s with 475 horsepower. Cummins NTC 350s, Caterpillar power, which became available starting in 1970. You picked the engine. Brockway built the truck around it. Then in 1968 came Huskidrive. This was Brockway's signature integrated drivetrain package and the thing that gave the Huskie name its real engineering substance. A 6-cylinder Cummins NH diesel rated at 248 horsepower, married to a 5-speed Fuller transmission and 2-speed rear ends. That gave you 10 effective gear ratios, specifically calibrated for the brutal, low-speed, high-torque work that Brockway customers demanded day in and day out. Hauling gravel from quarries in the Finger Lakes. Plowing snow through central New York winters where the temperature drops below zero for weeks. Moving construction aggregate up grades that would stall a lighter, less determined truck. You could spot a Huskidrive model instantly. Instead of the standard single Husky dog on the grill, Huskidrive trucks wore a pair of dogs mounted side by side atop the grill. Dual mascots, pulling in harness. Not subtle, not meant to be. 248 horsepower. That does not sound like much. Even for the late 60s, you could order bigger numbers from other makers. But Huskidrive was never about peak output on a dyno sheet. It was about the torque curve, that thick, constant pulling power at low RPM when you were breaking loose from a dead stop with 40 tons of gravel behind you and a 12% grade ahead. The Cummins NH was a torque monster in the low and middle range, and the 5 and 2 drivetrain combination put that torque exactly where the work was happening. Brockway customers did not give a damn about bragging rights at truck stops. They cared about getting the load where it needed to go. Huskidrive delivered. The 16-speed air-shift transmission was another popular option on non-Huskidrive models. This was a major improvement over the old 2-stick compound gearboxes that required warming the transmission fluid on cold mornings before the gears would engage. With the old setup, you had to put the main box in gear, leave the auxiliary in neutral, and just sit there letting everything circulate until the oil loosened up enough to shift. The AirShift 16-speed eliminated most of that cold weather misery and was considered a genuine quality-of-life improvement by every driver who used one. The Cummins NH in Huskidrive trim was an under-stressed engine. That was the point. Running well below its theoretical maximum output meant less heat, less wear, fewer blown gaskets at 2 a.m. on a January morning in Binghamton. Longevity was baked into the calibration. These engines would run for hundreds of thousands of miles before needing a major overhaul. And when they did need work, every Cummins dealer in the Northeast could service them. No proprietary Brockway-only components to track down. No waiting 6 weeks for a factory part from Cortland. Walk into any truck shop from Maine to Maryland, and they had what you needed on the shelf. That was the genius of the assembled truck philosophy applied to the drivetrain. Every Brockway left the factory deliberately over-engineered. Frames heavier than they strictly needed to be. Axles rated above the loads they would typically carry. Sheet metal thicker than what competitors used. The components were frequently over-specified for their intended application. When your customer base includes operators who run their trucks 18 hours a day hauling rock out of quarries, who never baby anything, who consider a truck a tool to be used until it cannot be used anymore, you do not build to minimum specification. You build for the guy who is going to abuse your machine in ways the engineering department never imagined and then show up 5 years later asking for another one identical to the first. And they came back. Every time. Brockway's repeat customer loyalty was the best in the trucking industry. Entire municipal fleets in upstate New York were exclusively Brockway. Highway departments, volunteer fire companies, excavation operations that had been running Huskies for generations. John Potter of Cortland, whose father worked the Brockway assembly line for more than 30 years and bought one the moment the factory closed. Richie Zigmont of Castle Creek, who loved the brand so much he named his son Brock. Clarence Ritchie up on the New York-Vermont border, who owns 35 Brockways in various states of repair. These people were not customers, they were the faithful. In 1971, the Huskidrive 500 series debuted, a low-profile cab-forward design built specifically for urban refuse collection, tight turning radius for narrow city streets, low step-in height for crews who climbed in and out of the cab hundreds of times every shift. Relatively few were built, but the Huskidrive proved that Brockway could innovate beyond its traditional market when the need arose. The 700 series came in 1974, the final full redesign. It used the Scheller Globe cab, similar to the one on the Mack R model, though the cabs manufactured for Brockway had specific engineering differences compared to the Mack versions. Different mounting geometry, different internal specifications. A Brockway man could tell. The 700 offered both the traditional butterfly hood and an optional fiberglass tilt-forward hood for improved engine access. A genuine step forward in serviceability and driver comfort. The timing, though, was catastrophic. 1974, the oil crisis, fuel prices doubling, interest rates climbing. Nobody was buying new trucks. And then the federal government dropped FMVSS 121, mandating anti-lock braking systems that the entire industry could barely manufacture and that customers absolutely refused to pay for. Heavy truck sales across the industry fell off a cliff. Brockway's workaround was the glider kit. Frame, cab, hood, fenders, radiator, front axle. No complete truck, because the regulation applied only to finished vehicles rolling off a production line. In July of 1976, Brockway started shipping glider kits. It was clever. It was also the kind of regulatory evasion that told you just how cornered the industry had become. The manufacturers eventually took the Department of Transportation to court and won. The anti-lock mandate was repealed in 1978. Too late for Brockway. The union contract with UAW Local 68 expired in October of 1976. Mack offered an extension. The union rejected it. A wildcat strike erupted in early January of '77. Workers walked off the line after lunch. They came back briefly. Then, on February 8th, they struck again. On March 30th, Mack announced the closure of the Brockway division. The official reason was union troubles. The real story was more tangled. Brockway was a small-volume producer in a market that increasingly rewarded scale and geographic reach. Their customer base was concentrated in the Northeast. Despite 20 years under Mack's umbrella, they never expanded nationally. You would think Mack would have turned Brockway into a specialty niche brand and sold them through Mack dealerships coast to coast. They never did. Brockway kept doing its own thing in its own region, building its own trucks for its own people. It worked beautifully when times were good. When the economy turned, there was nowhere to run. The recession was biting. Regulations were strangling the industry. The strike was the match, but the kindling had been stacking up for years. A New York attorney named Stephen Romer tried to purchase the company. The deal never came together, but there was one final order to fulfill. Inter-American Transport in Miami needed 45 heavy tractors destined for hauling sugarcane in Iran. When the Cortland plant shuttered, Mack shipped every required component to a warehouse in Miami. A crew of Brockway managers and supervisors, The same men who had built these trucks for years on Central Avenue assembled them by hand over several months in that Florida warehouse, far from everything they knew. The very last Brockway, a U762TL, was completed on June 8, 1977. Detroit diesel, 12,571. 12 cylinders. 2-stroke diesel. 15-speed Road Ranger transmission, 55,000-pound rear axles. 102 years after William Brockway hammered together his first carriage in Homer, the line was done. There is a bitter postscript. The 1978 film Convoy features a white 1972 Brockway 361 tractor. During filming, the loaded trailer toppled on a sharp turn and took the truck with it. The actress, playing Widow Woman, kicked the downed Brockway in frustration, abandoned it, and the hero drove off in a Mack. The crash was unscripted. The scene stayed in the movie. The symbolism wrote itself. But the dog did not die. In 2000, the Brockway Trucks Preservation Association was founded. Every August since, the Huskies come home. Well over 100 vintage Brockways converge on Cortland for the National Truck Show. They parade down Main Street, just blocks from where they were built. Owners drive in from Florida, Delaware, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Ontario, and occasionally Australia. An enthusiast from down under discovered Brockways on the internet in 2000 and has traveled to Cortland every single year since. Wayne Diffenbach, who spent 8 years as an industrial engineer at the Brockway plant from 69 to 77, makes the trip back from Florida. Wayne Chalane's sons helped him restore a 69 361 in their backyard over 7 years. His son Michael drove it on the road for the first time July 1, 2011. Michael died 6 months later from surgical complications the day after his 21st birthday. He is memorialized on the door of that orange and black truck. Peter Grimm repatriated a 1931 Brockway hearse from Argentina. He also owns a purple and yellow 76 model with an 850-plus horsepower 12-cylinder Detroit that he runs at truck pulls. The Metzger family from Shelby, Ohio, rebuilt a 74 cabover with an 1,150 cubic inch Cummins, making 3,220 horsepower. They call it Brockosaurus. And here is perhaps the most remarkable thing. Many of these trucks still work. Not museum pieces parked under covers, not trailered show queens polished for photographs. Working trucks, hauling topsoil, moving gravel, plowing roads, doing exactly what they were designed to do nearly 50 years after the factory went dark. The excavation outfits and municipal departments that bought them in the 70s just kept running them because they would not quit. After Brockway closed, the Mack Superliner appeared. Longtime Brockway people noticed more than a passing resemblance to those final Brockway designs, changed the grille, changed the fenders. But the fundamental architecture looked familiar. Brockway men always notice. Cortland is still called Huskie Town, USA. The Brockway Museum at the Central New York Living History Center still draws visitors every year. And sitting in that museum is a 1925 Brockway fire truck that 4 Argentine volunteer firefighters drove 17,000 miles from Buenos Aires to Cortland in 1959. They crossed the Andes on log rafts. They floated the truck across rivers. They managed a top speed of 5 miles per hour through jungle. They arrived on May 7, 1960, 15 months after they left. Brockway accepted the old truck in a straight trade for a new one and shipped the replacement to Argentina free of charge. Some things are simply too stubborn to stop. They do not build trucks like this anymore, not because the engineering was magic, but because the philosophy was different. Build it heavier than it needs to be. Use the best available components. Let the customer tell you what they need, then build exactly that. Do not change things that work. Hire people who care about what they put their name on. And put a dog on the hood that actually means something. The Husky pulled in harness, head down, leaning into the load. That was not a mascot. That was a mission statement. And nearly 50 years after the last one rolled off the line, the faithful are still keeping that promise. And there you have it, the Brockway Husky, never the biggest, never the fastest, never built its own engine. Just the toughest truck on the road for 65 years running. If you have seen one up close, or your old man drove one, tell me about it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.